Well, okay, so I have a few more words to say regarding the entire situation in the Ukraine. But before I do that, I would like to explain that perhaps to viewers who don't know me very well from the past, that I've had a keen interest in United States foreign policy. So I'm not a newcomer to the subject. And for anybody that even wants to understand the the mainstream of American foreign policy, you cannot possibly understand its objective without reading The Grand Chessboard by Brzezinski. This is essential reading if you want to understand what American foreign policy is all about. And I might add to this that this is not some sort of a partisan foreign policy. No, it belongs to both parties in the United States, both political parties. That is the thinking here, because you eventually come to understand that there are some minor differences in regards to foreign policy when it comes to Republicans or Democrats, but essentially the policy has remained the same ever since Kissinger and Brzezinski appeared on the picture. And these people are without a doubt very influential in foreign policy circles here in the United States. So this just as a preamble, okay? So for anyone to say that that the situation in Ukraine is something easy to discuss, I would say it's not something easy to discuss, although our mainstream media, of course, is going along the lines of these major U.S. foreign policy thinkers all the way. There is virtually no room for any other opinion out there in the mainstream. And some of the stuff that you read on the internet as well is, some of it is completely idiotic, totally uninformed. But I would come from the perspective that it is not in our best interests as world citizens to dismiss the strategic planning of thinkers like Brzezinski and in the past Kissinger, because it has often been underestimated. And so I would caution against this underestimation and the machinations which are going on today. So obviously, as you could imagine, I've read the book, The Grand Chess Game, a long time ago. This was during the breakup of the Soviet Union when this book was penned by Brzezinski. And, he has come up with various theses and prescriptions and so on. And he is, of course, staunchly anti-communist, and he essentially was involved in instigating a few coups d'états around the globe. So this should come as nothing new for anybody who has, followed American foreign policy. But this is a newer book of his, and it's called A Strategic Vision. It's not an advertisement for the book, by the way, but it's called Strategic Vision. And in contrast to his prior book, The Grand Chessboard, he now realizes that America's empire, so to speak, the one that he was pretty much in favor of when he wrote the chessboard, because that was all about American supremacy all over the globe. This is what this book was all about, because essentially the thesis of the book contained the idea that American supremacy across the globe should not be challenged by anyone, by any arising power whatsoever, whether it is in Europe or China or Russia or anyone else should challenge this power. Well, having now come to the realization that this is not exactly the current reality anymore, Brzezinski now takes a few steps back, and it's interesting to read some of the ways in the way that he rationalizes it. And one of the things that he laments deeply, but he realizes that this is now the reality, because America, except for its military adventures, is no longer an unchallenged power globally. So there will be challenges posed, and evidently he laments that superiority. But what he laments even more is essentially democracy and the power of people across the globe in and of itself. So here is one chapter of his book from which I will read excerpts, entitled The Impact of Global Political Awakening. The ongoing dispersal of global power is furthered by the emergence of a volatile phenomenon, the worldwide political awakening of populations, until recently politically passive or repressed. Occurring recently in Central and Eastern Europe and lately in the Arab world, this awakening is the cumulative product of an interactive and interdependent world connected by instant visual communications, and of the democratic youth bulge, he calls it, in the less advanced countries and societies, composed of the easy to mobilize and politically restless university students and the socially deprived and unemployed. Both groups resent the richer portions of humanity and the privileged corruption of their rulers. That resentment of authority and privilege is unleashing populists' passions with unprecedented potential for generating large-scale turmoil. Now let this sink in for a moment. So in other words, people are politically awakening, even in the third world. They have been awake for a long time, I might add, but now they're becoming more politically active, and that evidently is somehow resented by Brzezinski. So he says their daily lives prior to this awakening, he calls it, were focused on personal survival in conditions of physical and material deprivations. He then goes on to say that religion offered some solace, while social traditions provided some degree of cultural stability and occasional collective relief from the hardships of fate. The hardships of fate. Fate, he calls this. Struggles for power at the top tended to be confined to a narrow circle of participants, while group conflicts with adjoining communities focused largely on territorial or material possessions and were fueled by instinctive ethnic hatreds and divergent religious beliefs. This is Brzezinski's take on global turmoil. Now, he goes on to say that, with the global communications, the global media, especially the internet, people are becoming aware in the rest of the world what is going on in the rest of the world, and he believes this to be a threat. He believes this to be a threat to the West in particular. So he goes on in this entire book, essentially, he goes on to lament the decline in power of essentially the politically connected elites globally. And he goes on to say that because of the printing press, he starts out with the printing press, by the way, and he says that the gradual spread of literacy among the growing concentration of urban residents transformed individual political awakening into a mass phenomenon. Now, I might remind you, he goes all the way back to the invention of the printing press. But now, he goes on to say pamphleteering and the emergence of regularly published newspapers during the 19th century began to stoke popular desires for political change. As people in the middle class, by the way, there wasn't any middle class when he is talking about the Middle Ages here, okay, during the invention of the printing press. There was no middle class. But he goes on to say, as the people in the middle class and upper classes took on the habit of regularly reading newspapers, their political awareness grew, and political dialogue about the state of national affairs became a normal social occurrence. The appearance of radio in the early 20th century then gave political oratory a nationwide reach. And he puts in parentheses, think Hitler, as if radio was just being, as if the phenomenon of radio was just happening in Germany and not in the United States as well. While giving even distant events a sense of a dramatic immediacy, exposing politically passive and semi-isolated people to to the cacophony of political clamor. Now, he goes on to speak about the emergence of global television, sloganeering, and so on, and then goes into launch into, some sort of a expose of essentially a media phenomenon which cannot be stopped. Now, nowhere does he mention that media, American media or media elsewhere, has always been used in part for propaganda purposes by the state and by non-state actors as well, such as global corporations. Now, we don't have news in the United States, essentially, which is not sponsored by advertisers. So it is not exactly a neutral phenomenon or even a grounded uprising from below. In fact, what we get to see in the mainstream media in the United States is largely sponsored by advertisers and by global corporations. So this imagined vision of Brzezinski, saying that this is some sort of a media uprising from below, as it pertains to the mass media in America at least, is essentially laughable. I will go through a few more excerpts from this book. Particularly interesting might be his view on the the uprisings in the Middle East. Essentially, what he's saying is the popular uprisings in North Africa and the Middle East during the first few months of 2011 provide a particularly vivid example of the potential consequences of the accelerating political awakenings characterized by the convergence of disaffected youth bulges, he calls them, with increasing accessible mass communications technology. They were driven by resentment against corrupt and unresponsive national leaderships, local frustrations with unemployment, political disenfranchisement, and prolonged periods of emergency rule, such as in Egypt. Emergency laws provided the immediate motivating impulse. Leaders who had been secure in their rule for decades, essentially rulers that the United States has supported. He doesn't mention this anywhere, of course, but he says leaders who had been secure in their role for decades found themselves suddenly confronted by the political awakening that had been gestating in the Middle East ever since the end of the imperial era. Well, I would venture to say that the imperial era never ended in the Middle East. So the interaction between the disenfranchised but politically aroused youth populations of the Middle East and the revolution in communication technology is now an important reality of geopolitics in this century. So yes, he realizes there is a political reality emerging. At the same time, there's no mention in this book of how this political reality and through this very technology can also be remanipulated into the very thing into the very thing that brings about the new media colonialism, which we're now essentially witnessing. After all, the democratically elected uh, government in Egypt was overthrown, and uh, how was it overthrown? You know, that wasn't exactly a democratic move when the military was essentially um, tasked to take these Muslim Brotherhood people down. You know, just last week they announced that 600 and some people are sentenced to death simply for protesting. Uh, some of that was done in absentia, I guess, but you know, this is what's going on in Egypt today. So this revolution that Brzezinski is speaking of was, of course, thwarted. And it was thwarted, I might add, by Western governments as well. So he goes on to say, in today's post-colonial world, the new politically awakened partake of a common historical narrative that interprets their relative deprivation, prolonged external domination, denial of self-dignity, and continued personal disadvantage as the collective legacy of Western domination. In other words, people in the Middle East are resenting this Western domination, is what he's saying, and it is directed entirely against the West, when in fact it was also against the nationalists in Egypt and elsewhere. So this uprising is, it's difficult to explain, but this is how Brzezinski likes to explain it. He goes on to say its anti-colonial sharp edge is aimed at the West, fed by vivid memories of British, French, Portuguese, Spanish, Belgian, Dutch, Italian, and German colonialism. There's no word in this book about US imperialism or colonialism. It's nowhere to be found. Particularly funny was this paragraph in his book, when he is basically talking about this fascination with technology in the Middle East. The continued attraction of the American system, the vital relevance of its founding principles, the dynamism of its economic model, and the goodwill of its people and government. I'm not sure about the government, but yeah, the people is therefore essential. If America is to continue playing a constructive global role. Only by demonizing the capacity for a superior performance of its societal system can America restore its historical momentum, which has basically only lasted for about 270 years, I might add, especially in the face of a China that is increasingly attractive to the third world. For example, when the United States presented itself as the undisputed champion of anti-colonialism at the end of World War II, I have something to add to this, by the way, undisputed champion of anti-colonialism, okay? At the end of World War II, America became the preferred alternative, primarily in contrast to Great Britain, for those states seeking to bring themselves into modernity via free enterprise. for some reason, Brzezinski cannot be honest enough to say that essentially the United States was involved and primarily engaged and supported the apartheid regime in South Africa, which was a colonial regime up until it fell. And then popular opinion and boycotts turned against this regime, which to the very end was supported by the United States foreign policy establishment, I might add, until it became politically untenable to do so. And of course, what did they do afterwards? They bribed and got into their own fold the the ANC and the arising leadership in Africa as well, all under the rubric of so-called free enterprise. So this is, I guess this has been a long video. It's been 21 minutes or something. I will probably continue with another video, again, referring to Brzezinski's book here, because if you want to know where foreign policy, U.S. foreign policy is headed and what its aim is, you really need to understand this. I also want to make very clear, I realize this video wasn't about Ukraine, but I'll get to that in the next video. You need to understand that I'm not, I'm not anti-American. I'm not pro-Putin. I realize that both regimes are completely without the support of the majority of the population. Both regimes are corrupt in a way. But I do want to emphasize that in terms of national interests, as far as Russia is concerned, Russia should be taken very seriously as far as their foreign policy is concerned as well. So it's not just us. And what people like me want to do is essentially to avoid World War III. So both interests need to be taken into account without, unleashing a thermonuclear war over essentially arguments that have existed throughout time. This preponderance of power, these clashes of the ruling elites, where the people are, as Brzezinski is so fond of saying, merely pawns on a chessboard.